r/NoSleep. 2 knocks mean you're next. I just heard the first one. I moved to Ash Hollow 6 months ago. The kind of town you only ever find by accident, tucked between thick woods and a lake that always seems too still. The realtor said I was lucky. Dirt cheap rent, a cozy little cabin on the outskirts, even a general store that sold fresh bread every morning. It was supposed to be a fresh start. The first person to welcome me was Eli, the town's sheriff. He knocked on my door the first evening with a friendly enough smile, but something in his posture felt off. He didn't step inside. Just handed me a box of donuts and got right to the point. "If you hear knocking at night," he said, his voice measured, "you come to me the next morning." No hesitation. I half laughed, thinking it was some local joke. Why? Kids pulling pranks? Eli's smile didn't change, but his fingers flexed against his belt. "Just promise me." I nodded, still thinking it was small-town nonsense. Maybe the last guy who lived here had been paranoid, and the town humored his delusions. Either way, I didn't ask questions. The first month passed uneventfully. The townsfolk were polite but distant, the way people get when they've seen too many newcomers come and go. I settled in, learned to appreciate the quiet, and even made a habit of sitting on my porch at night, watching the lake reflect the moon like a black mirror. Then one morning, I saw a moving truck in front of a house down the road. The Dyer family, young couple, 2 kids, happy to be here. Their excitement was refreshing, a reminder that I wasn't the only outsider trying to make this place home. 3 weeks later, I woke up to find their house abandoned. No lights, no car, the front door left half open. I walked over, knocking, calling their names. Nothing. Inside, the furniture was still there. Their belongings untouched. Just empty. Like they had left in a hurry. Eli arrived not long after, his cruiser kicking up dust in the morning light. He barely glanced at the house before turning to me. "Go home," he said, like a father scolding a child. "You don't need to know more." But I did. I had to. That afternoon, I peeked through the Dyer's front door. Everything was normal, except for the single word etched into the wood inside the hallway, "Stay out." I asked around town. No one said a word. But that evening, at the general store, old Mr. Franklin finally muttered something under his breath as I passed him in the canned goods aisle. "They heard a knock," he said, barely above a whisper. "First one." It took a second to register. A knock. I walked home slower that night, suddenly aware of how deep the silence ran here. No crickets. No wind. Just stillness. Weeks passed. The Dyers became an afterthought, their house untouched. I convinced myself it was just a freak event. Maybe they had debts. Maybe they ran. Maybe I'd never know. Then last night, at exactly 12:13 a.m., I heard it. A single knock. Soft. Measured. Not frantic, not loud. Just deliberate. One knock, from somewhere near the front door. I froze. Remembered Eli's warning. The town's silence. The empty house down the road. I didn't check. I didn't move. I sat in bed with my fists clenched, staring at my bedroom door, waiting for something worse. Nothing came. This morning, I went straight to Eli's office. He was waiting for me, eyes tired, hands already reaching for a file before I even spoke. "I heard it," I said. He nodded like he'd been expecting it. "You need to pack your things." I laughed, but it sounded wrong in my throat. "Come on. One knock? What happens if I hear 2? His face went pale. He didn't answer. I left, deciding he was insane. That the whole town was insane. I wasn't about to flee over superstition. Tonight, I'm sitting at my kitchen table, lights off, waiting. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone wants me gone. Maybe it was nothing at all. But the clock just hit 12:13 again. And there it is. The second knock. It wasn't any louder than the first, but something about it made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was waiting. My fingers curled tight around the kitchen table's edge. My gut screamed at me to run, to grab my keys, throw whatever I could into a bag, and drive until Ash Hollow was nothing but a bad memory. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I needed to know. Slowly, carefully, I stood up. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way toward the front door. I didn't turn on the lights. I barely breathed. Every instinct in me screamed not to look, but I had to. Just a peek. Just to prove to myself that it was nothing. I reached the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. Nothing. Just the dark porch, empty and still. Then the porch light flickered. For half a second, I saw something standing just beyond the glow. A shadow. Tall and wrong. Not a person, not really. The shape of a man but stretched, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And eyes like holes punched into the night, blacker than the dark around them. I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs. My hand scrambled for the deadbolt, twisting it tight, locking the door, securing every latch I could find. Then, silence. I backed away, breath shuddering in my chest. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a warning. It was something worse. Something old. Something patient. And then my phone rang. The sudden noise nearly sent me to the floor. My hands fumbled to grab it, and I saw the caller ID, Sheriff Eli. I answered. Eli. You have to leave. His voice was urgent, but low. Almost like he was afraid of being overheard. Right now. Grab your keys. Don't pack, don't think. Just leave. What the hell is going on? I whispered, my body already moving, grabbing for my jacket. What happens after 2 knocks? Silence. Then. You don't want to know. I pressed him. Eli, tell me. A heavy breath on the other end. And then, barely above a whisper. The 3rd knock means it's inside. The air left my lungs. My knees went weak. I turned toward the door as if expecting it to burst open. But it didn't. Not yet. A creak sounded behind me. I spun toward the living room. The lights were still off, but the air felt wrong. Thicker. Heavy. Like the house itself was holding its breath. I took a step forward, then another. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long in the darkness. And then, at the very end of it, I saw my bedroom door. It was open. I never left it open. Cold dread flooded my veins. My fingers trembled as I reached for the light switch. My brain screamed at me not to do it, not to confirm what I already knew in my bones. I flicked the switch. Light flooded the hallway. My bedroom door was still open. The bed was still unmade. The window still shut. But something was wrong. The air felt used, like something had been breathing it in, stale and thick. Then I saw them. Footprints. Dark, wet footprints leading from the threshold of my room to where I stood frozen in the hallway. And I hadn't heard a 3rd knock. The realization sent ice through my spine. I wasn't waiting for the 3rd knock. I was already too late. The breath on my neck came first. Hot and damp. Then the voice. Low, rasping. You shouldn't have looked. I turned, and the lights flickered. The next morning, Sheriff Eli stood outside my house. His expression was grim, hands gripping his belt so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The house was empty. The furniture was still there. My car was still parked outside. My jacket lay crumpled on the floor near the kitchen table. The door was locked from the inside. No one ever found me. But inside the house, carved deep into the bedroom wall, were 3 words. He let it in. Eli exhaled through his nose, closed his eyes, and turned to the officer beside him. Listed for rent, he said. Someone else will come along. He started toward his cruiser. And as he did, the wind carried a whisper from the trees. Low and rasping, thick with something old and hungry. It was laughing. The sound crawled through the trees, thick and slow, like molasses dripping from a spoon. It wasn't just a laugh, it was a knowing thing, stretching through the air, seeping into the bones of the house. Sheriff Eli clenched his jaw, forcing himself to ignore it, but the officer beside him wasn't as practiced. Deputy Collins shivered, eyes darting toward the tree line, his fingers twitching over the grip of his holstered pistol. You hear that? Collins asked, voice barely above a whisper. Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. Of course he heard it. Everyone did, sooner or later. Instead, he slid into his cruiser, turned the key, and let the engine growl to life. The house in the rearview mirror stood silent, the curtains still undrawn. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. And yet, as he pulled away, he could swear he felt eyes pressing against his back, watching, waiting. He'd done all he could. Another house. Another name. Another warning that would be ignored. He exhaled slowly. No one ever listened. The listing for the house went up the following week. The Dyer house remained untouched, the furniture still gathering dust. A new family moved in across town, a young woman named Becca and her fiancé, Drew. They didn't ask about the vacancies, Didn't question why so many houses sat abandoned. No one ever did. Ash Hollow had its secrets, and those secrets had patience. Then, 6 months later, a man named Daniel Harris arrived. Daniel didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. He believed in patterns. Superstitions were just unspoken rules, and rules always had a reason, a source, a beginning. It was just a matter of finding it. The house was perfect. Secluded. Quiet. Cheap. Everything he needed to finally finish his book. The locals were distant, which suited him just fine. He didn't need friends, just space. He signed the lease the same day. The real estate agent handed him the keys with too much haste, her smile thin. "If you hear anything strange at night." "I know," he cut in, rolling his eyes. "Go straight to the sheriff." Her lips parted as if to say more, then she stopped herself. Instead, she nodded once, turned, and left. That night, Daniel unpacked, cooked a simple meal, and stretched out on his couch with a glass of wine. The house creaked in the way all old houses did. The trees outside rustled in the wind. The night settled, dark and deep. At 12:13 a.m., he heard the first knock. Soft. Measured. Deliberate. He didn't move. Didn't react. He waited, listening, pulse steady. The knock didn't come again. The wind shifted. Silence pressed against the house like a held breath. A test, then. He marked the time in his journal and went to bed. The next morning, he found Sheriff Eli waiting on his porch. "You heard it." Daniel smirked, sipping his coffee. "What happens if I ignore it?" Eli's jaw tightened. "You don't want to find out." Daniel shrugged. "Guess I'll see for myself." Eli's fingers flexed against his belt. He exhaled sharply through his nose. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Weeks passed. The town remained indifferent, the locals polite but distant. At 12:13 a.m. on the 15th night, Daniel heard the second knock. This time, it wasn't from the front door. It was from inside the house. Daniel sat up in bed, pulse hammering. The knock came again, just once, from somewhere in the kitchen. He grabbed the baseball bat beside his bed and moved carefully, slow and deliberate. The kitchen was empty. The porch light flickered. He swallowed hard, muscles coiled. The house was playing with him now. Testing him. Daniel gritted his teeth, exhaled slowly, and whispered to the empty room, "Nice try." He didn't sleep that night. Eli was waiting for him the next morning, leaning against his cruiser, arms crossed. "You packing yet?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Eli sighed, rubbing his temple. "Damn it, Daniel. You don't get to be stubborn about this." Daniel leaned in slightly. "Tell me what happens next." Eli hesitated. Then, quietly, "The third knock means it's inside." Daniel stared at him. "And then what?" Eli didn't answer. Daniel lasted 4 more nights. At 12:13 a.m. on the 5th night, the third knock came. Not from the front door. Not from the kitchen. It came from the bedroom closet. Daniel sat up slowly. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against his skin. His breath came shallow. His fingers trembled over the bedsheet. Something moved behind the closet door. A slow, deliberate shift. The wood groaned under its weight. Daniel forced himself to breathe evenly. He reached for the bat, heart pounding against his ribs. Then, the door creaked open. Darkness yawned from within. Something stepped forward. Daniel saw a shape, tall and wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Black eyes swallowed the dim glow from the street lamp outside. Its breath came slow, rasping. It didn't move. It just watched. Daniel's pulse slammed against his throat. He gripped the bat tighter, forcing himself to stand, to move, to react. His mind screamed at him to run, but he stayed rooted, staring into the void of its face. Then it smiled. It didn't have a mouth. But it smiled anyway. Daniel swung the bat. Darkness swallowed the room. The next morning, Sheriff Eli stood outside the house. His expression was unreadable, eyes hard. Daniel's car was still parked in the driveway. His suitcase remained unpacked. The front door was locked from the inside. No one ever found him. Inside the house, carved deep into the bedroom wall, were 3 words. He knew better. Eli exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He turned to Deputy Collins. "Listed for rent." Collins swallowed hard. "Again?" Eli's eyes flicked to the tree line, Where the shadows ran too deep? He nodded. Someone else will come along. The wind shifted. And from the woods, something laughed.